Hey, what's up guys? In this video I'm going to show you how to simplify radicals by using the quotient property for radicals. So that is when you guys have a fraction inside of the radical, which is the square root. So the first thing you need to look for is if you can simplify the fraction inside, so that's called the radicand, and 2 over 10 you can simplify. So I'm just going to simplify by 2. You guys can divide the top by 2 and the bottom. So we keep the square root or the radical, and that's going to become 1 over 5. Now the quotient property for radicals is when you separate the numerator and the denominator with its own radical. So what I mean is you will have the square root on the top and the square root on the bottom in the fraction. So it's going to look like this. The square root of 1 on the top, and the bottom is going to have the square root of 5. The top, we have a 1 inside of the radical. That is a perfect square number, so we can find the square root of 1. So that's going to be 1. And the bottom of the fraction, 5, is not a perfect square number, and it's a prime number. So that means that you cannot break it down. You cannot simplify the square root of 5. So I'm going to leave it like that for now, the square root of 5 in the denominator. One of the things that we have to do when we have fractions, if we have a radical on the bottom, we have to get rid of it. You have to rationalize the denominator so you guys don't have radicals in the denominator. So to do that, to get rid of the radical, you are going to multiply that denominator by itself. So I'm going to multiply by the square root of 5. But we know that whatever you do to the bottom of the fraction, you also have to do to the top of the fraction. So you will multiply the top by the square root of 5. So when you guys multiply the top, well, we have a 1 times the square root of 5. Anything multiplied by 1 is going to be itself. So the top is just going to stay as the square root of 5. And the bottom, you can multiply by using the product property. And that was on my last video. When you multiply radicals, you can multiply the numbers inside of the radical. You guys will have the square root of 25. And the square root of 25 will be 5 on the bottom of the fraction. So we can simplify this or rewrite it as the square root of 5 over 5. So a couple of things. Number one, since the top has a radical and the bottom doesn't have a radical, you cannot divide the 5 and the 5 that you guys see in the fraction. Yeah, you can say they're not like terms, but they cannot be divided because they need, if you guys want to divide both numbers, they need to have a radical, and the bottom doesn't have one. Another thing is, second thing, the bottom doesn't have a radical anymore, so that's what we want for our answer. So our exact answer or radical form, the answer is the square root of 5 over 5. So another example is when you cannot simplify the fraction inside of the radical. So 5 over 32, we have the square root of that fraction. You cannot divide, you cannot reduce the fraction. So we just use the quotient property to separate the top and the bottom. So I'm going to do the square root of 5 on the top of the fraction and the square root of 32 on the bottom. Now the top, it's a 5, the square root of 5, and 5 is a prime number, so you cannot break it down. You cannot simplify this square root. But the bottom, 32, is not a perfect square number, but we can actually simplify the 32. You can break it down, and I use prime factorization to make pairs, and that's how you guys simplify the radical. So I'm going to put 32 on the side. I'm just going to do it here so you guys can see how I'm going to break it down. So 32, you can multiply 8 times 4, that's 32. You can use 16 times 2, that's 32. But whatever numbers you guys use, you have to multiply to 32. The 8, you can break it down to 4 times 2, and the 4 here, you can multiply 2 times 2. So I see that I can make a pair of 2's right now, but let's go ahead and break down the 4 again. 2 times 2. So I'm going to look for those pairs, and I'm going to make a box. So the pair of 2's, and remember that 2 is a prime number, so you guys cannot break it down again because it's prime. So 2, there's a pair. We have another pair over here. And then this 2 will stay inside of the radical because we cannot have a pair, or we do not have a pair for that number. So we continue with simplifying the radical. The top stays the same, but the bottom, well, remember that we have 2 pair of 2's. since we have 2 pairs, I'm going to write down the number twice, and I'm going to multiply outside of the radical. So here's the radical, 2 times 2. Once again, I have 2 times 2 because I have 2 pairs, so you write down the number twice, 2 times 2. Inside of the radical, you guys will have the 2 that doesn't have a pair. Now we're not finished because you guys can multiply the 2 numbers outside, 2 times 2. So the top is the square root of 5 and the bottom will be 4 square root of 2. Now again, remember that on the bottom of the fraction, we cannot have a radical, so we have to rationalize the denominator. But here's the thing, these 2 numbers are multiplying. 4 is multiplying the square root of 2 and 4 doesn't have a radical. So the only thing we have to get rid of is the radical, and it has a 2. So I'm going to multiply the bottom by that radical, not the 4, just the square root of 2. So you guys will keep the 4 because it doesn't have a radical on the bottom of the fraction. And whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do it to the top. Now on the top of the fraction, you guys have 2 numbers with a radical. So we can use the product property here. We can multiply the radicands, the numbers inside, and you keep the square root. So 5 times 2 will be 10, and I keep the radical, so the square root of 10. On the bottom, well, you guys have this 4 outside of the radical. So first of all, you keep the 4, and then you guys will multiply the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. You can do this mentally. 2 times 2 is 4, and then you take the square root of 4, which is 2. So you're going to multiply that number 4 times the 2. So I'm going to finish the bottom of the fraction. I keep the square root of 10 on the top, and 4 times 2 is 8. And when you guys look at these 2 numbers, again, you cannot simplify because the top has a radical, the bottom doesn't have a radical. 10 is not a perfect square number, but if you try to break it down, you're not going to make pairs. And just to show you, I'll do that here on the side. So if you guys want to break down the 10, that's going to be 5 times 2. 5 is prime, 2 is prime, so we cannot break those numbers down. They don't have pairs, so you cannot simplify the square root of 10. It stays as it is. So my radical form, my answer is square root of 10 over 8. And I'll do one more when you have to multiply fractions inside of the radical. So here we have the square root of 3 over 4 times the square root of 4 over 5. So the product property, you guys can multiply the numbers inside, and they are fractions. You guys cannot simplify the fraction 3 over 4 and 4 over 5. So I'm just going to multiply, and I'm going to keep one big radical, and I'm going to write down the 2 fractions inside multiplying the 2 fractions. Now when you guys multiply fractions, you guys can cross simplify, or you can check if you can cross simplify. And I can. In this case, you guys have 4 and 4 across from each other, one's on the bottom, one's on the top. So we can simplify those numbers by 4. You can reduce by 4. So 4 goes into 4 one time, and the 4 goes into 4 one time. Now the numbers across here, 3 and 5, you cannot simplify, so you guys keep those as they are. Now you guys will multiply the numerators, the top numbers, and then you guys multiply the denominators. So I'm going to keep the radical. The top will be 3 times 1. That's going to be 3. And the bottom, you guys have 1 times 5. That's going to be 5. Now you guys cannot simplify the fraction again. The numbers 3 and 5 are prime numbers, so you guys cannot break them down. But we have to use the quotient property now to separate the top and the bottom. So the top will be the square root of 3, and the bottom will be the square root of 5. And again, on the bottom, we cannot have a radical, so we have to rationalize this square root. It is the square root of 5. So I'm going to multiply by the same radical. I multiply the bottom, and I multiply the top. So on the top, these 2 numbers, they do have radicals. 3 and the 5, they have a square root. So you can multiply the numbers inside of the radical. So that's going to be the square root of 15. And the bottom, you can do this mentally. You multiply 5 times 5 will be 25. And the square root of 25 is 5. And I hope you guys already noticed that when you multiply a radical by itself, your answer is just the radicand, the number inside of the radical. That's what happens when you multiply a radical by itself, and that's how you get rid of the radical, the square root. So my answer in radical form is the square root of 15 over 5. Alright guys, so this concludes my video. If you guys like my videos, you guys can click that like button. You can also subscribe to my channel. Make sure you guys practice, and I'll see you guys later.